The image of Elvis Presley that the world remembers is often larger than life. The man in dazzling jumpsuits commanding sold-out arenas and sending shockwaves through music history with every note he sang. But behind the bright lights and the roaring applause was a quieter truth, one that few ever witnessed. Each morning at Graceland, before rehearsals, before business meetings, before stepping back into the public gaze, Elvis often began his day with a ritual that kept him grounded, reading letters from his fans. Stacks of envelopes, sometimes hundreds at a time, would arrive at his home. They came from every corner of the world, from soldiers stationed overseas, widows struggling with loss, children dreaming of music, and ordinary men and women who felt compelled to write to the man whose voice had shaped their lives. For Elvis, these letters weren't background noise, they were lifelines, moments of honesty from strangers who somehow saw him not just as a star, but as a fellow human being who could understand their struggles. One letter might carry the trembling handwriting of a young woman describing the heartbreak of losing her brother in Vietnam. Another could come from an elderly fan who had followed Elvis since his earliest recordings, writing not to ask for anything but simply to thank him for years of comfort. And every now and then, Elvis would sit longer with a particular letter, reading it again and again, because within its pages he found not just a fan's words but echoes of his own private battles, with grief, loneliness, and the relentless weight of fame. It was in these moments, alone in his study, that Elvis's bond with his audience deepened far beyond the concert stage. Here was the man stripped of spectacle, sitting in silence, a pen sometimes in hand, choosing to respond in his own way. His answers were rarely long, but always sincere. A handwritten note, a signed photograph, a few words of encouragement. To the fans who received them, those small gestures became priceless treasures. To Elvis, they were reminders that the connection he created through music was not one-sided. This is the untold story of Elvis Presley's most personal letters, not just ink on paper, but reflections of empathy, humanity, and the power of being truly seen. Elvis Presley's relationship with his fans was unlike anything the world had ever seen. From the moment he first stepped onto a stage in the mid-1950s, he became more than an entertainer. He became a companion for millions who felt their own stories reflected in his songs. Yet while the crowd screamed his name and the headlines painted him as untouchable, Elvis himself often wrestled with a very different reality. Fame elevated him, but it also isolated him. And in that tension, the letters from fans became a quiet bridge between the man and the myth. Those who worked closest to him recalled how Elvis would sometimes sit in Graceland's study, with letters piled high on the desk. Assistants like Joe Esposito or Charlie Hodge might sort them into categories: requests, thank yous, personal stories. But Elvis never treated them like business. He treated them like voices. He believed that if someone took the time to write to him, the least he could do was give their words the dignity of his attention. Many of these letters carried stories of pain, stories that resonated with Elvis more deeply than fans could have imagined. A teenager might write about feeling like an outcast in their small town, bullied for being different. A soldier in Vietnam might describe playing Elvis's records in the barracks as a way of holding onto a sense of home. A grieving parent might confess how one song gave them the strength to keep going. These weren't just words on paper, they were testaments of survival, confessions of loneliness and prayers for comfort. Elvis, despite his fame, understood those emotions intimately. The world saw the king of rock and roll, but he carried the heavy shadow of losing his mother, Gladys, at the height of his early success, a loss that never left him. He knew the ache of longing for comfort, the hollow silence that fame couldn't fill. And so, when he read letters of grief or loneliness, he wasn't just sympathizing, he was remembering. He was connecting those words to his own pain, and in doing so, he found a bond that transcended distance and fame. Sometimes his responses were as simple as a signature across a glossy photo, but often he wrote back in his own hand. Fans who received those notes described the impact in terms far greater than celebrity admiration. To them, it was proof that they mattered, that their story had been heard by someone who carried weight in the world. It was Elvis's way of saying, "You are not invisible. I see you." This practice, small as it might seem in the grand spectacle of his career, reveals a side of Elvis that is often overlooked. Beyond the music charts and film posters, he was a man who understood the fundamental human need for recognition and connection. His letters showed that the bond between artist and audience wasn't one-sided. It was a dialogue, sometimes quiet, but always meaningful. In a world where fame could have easily created distance, Elvis chose to use letters as a way to close the gap. And in those quiet exchanges, he discovered something profound, that while his voice carried comfort across radios and concert halls, it was his willingness to acknowledge individual lives that truly gave people hope. The more Elvis read the letters, the more he recognized that they weren't just messages of admiration, they were cries for connection. Fame had made him an icon, but the letters reminded him he was also a mirror for millions of people who carried unspoken burdens. He began to notice patterns in what people shared: grief over loved ones lost, battles with illness, struggles with loneliness, and the quiet fear of being forgotten. One particular letter, preserved by a collector decades later, came from a young man drafted into the Vietnam War. He wrote of nights when he and fellow soldiers huddled around a small radio, listening to Elvis sing "Love Me Tender." For a few minutes, the jungle around them disappeared, replaced by the feeling of being back home with their families. "Your voice," the soldier wrote, "was the only thing that made me believe I'd see tomorrow." Elvis reportedly kept that letter close for weeks, telling friends that it humbled him more than any gold record could. Another time, a woman wrote to him about losing her teenage daughter in a car accident. She explained that she couldn't find the strength to get out of bed until she heard Elvis sing "You'll Never Walk Alone." She described it not as entertainment, but as a lifeline, a reminder that she wasn't alone in her grief. Elvis, deeply moved, took the time to reply personally, offering his prayers and a signed note. For that grieving mother, the letter became an heirloom, cherished for generations as proof that someone, even a man the world saw as untouchable, understood her pain. Reading these letters wasn't easy for Elvis. They carried weight. They reminded him of his own grief, particularly the loss of his mother, Gladys, who had been his anchor during his rise to fame. Her passing left a wound that fame could never cover. So when he encountered letters about loss, he wasn't reading them from the outside. He was reliving his own heartbreak, and sometimes the memories were overwhelming. Yet Elvis didn't turn away. Instead, he leaned into those stories, often staying up late at night with stacks of mail spread across his desk. He once told a friend that while the world might see him as a king, the letters reminded him he was still just a man who could feel, ache, and understand. It was this vulnerability that allowed him to connect so deeply with fans, far beyond the music. But with every letter came a responsibility. How could he carry the weight of so many lives, so many hopes placed on his shoulders? At times he confessed to feeling torn, burdened by the impossibility of answering them all, but unwilling to stop reading. The tension built quietly inside him. The more people reached out, the more he realized how much they needed him, not as a performer, but as a fellow human being who could say, "You matter." This growing awareness set the stage for a turning point in Elvis's understanding of his role. He began to realize that music was only part of his gift. The deeper calling was something more profound. The power to heal through acknowledgement, through presence, through simply letting another soul know they were not alone. The turning point came when Elvis began to see these letters not just as fan mail but as reflections of a universal truth, that everyone, no matter how ordinary or extraordinary, longs to be seen. One evening, after a long rehearsal at Graceland, Elvis sat with a letter from a teenager who wrote about feeling invisible at school. The boy explained that he didn't have many friends, but listening to Elvis's songs made him feel less alone. "When I hear you sing," he wrote, "I feel like someone understands me, even if you don't know me." Elvis read those words aloud to a friend and paused in silence. He tapped the page gently with his finger and said, "You see, this is why I sing. This is the whole reason." It was a moment of clarity, the realization that beyond the applause and the awards, his true calling was connection. This insight reshaped how Elvis approached his performances. On stage, he wasn't simply delivering songs. He was reaching out to every person in the audience who carried hurt, longing, or loneliness. He once explained in an interview that when he looked out at a crowd, he didn't just see fans, he saw people who brought their own stories into the room. "I want to make them feel like they matter," he said, "like they're part of something bigger than themselves." Letters only deepened that conviction. Some nights after a concert, Elvis would return to his room and read through a handful of notes sent backstage. The words could be overwhelming. Tales of broken families, illnesses, dreams deferred. But they also gave him perspective. They reminded him that despite the crushing pressure of his own life, he wasn't alone in carrying burdens. That awareness made his music more than performance. it made it communion. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this shift was how Elvis began responding. He no longer thought of replies as gestures of kindness alone. He saw them as acts of healing. A few lines in his handwriting, a simple acknowledgement, could change someone's outlook entirely. He once told a member of his inner circle, "Sometimes just telling someone they're not forgotten is all it takes to keep them going." This was the climax of Elvis's emotional journey with his fans, the realization that he was more than an entertainer. He was in his own way a healer. His songs were medicine for the heart, and his letters were proof that he cared enough to see the humanity behind the adoration. And yet this awareness also weighed heavily on him. To carry the stories of so many people, to feel their pain alongside his own, was both a gift and a burden. Elvis knew he couldn't answer every letter, couldn't solve every problem, but he also knew he could never turn away. That tension, between the impossibility of answering every call for connection and the responsibility he felt to try, defined his later years. In the quiet space between stage lights and fan mail, Elvis discovered something far greater than fame, that the truest measure of his legacy wouldn't be in records sold or tickets booked, but in how deeply he made people feel less alone. As Elvis grew older, the meaning of those letters stayed with him. The young man who had once shaken the world with rock and roll was now a seasoned performer, carrying years of triumphs and struggles, but his bond with fans through their words never weakened. In fact, as the pressures of fame and personal loss weighed more heavily on him, those letters became anchors, small reminders that beyond the glare of the spotlight, real human connections endured. Stories from friends and staff reveal that some fans held onto his handwritten replies for decades, treating them not as memorabilia, but as lifelines. One woman who had written to Elvis during a period of depression would later tell her children that the short note she received, only a few sentences wishing her strength, kept me alive when nothing else did. Another family preserved a signed photograph with a personal line of encouragement, as if it were a sacred heirloom, passing it down across generations. Elvis might not have realized the depth of these impacts at the time, but each response planted a seed of hope that grew long after the ink dried. For Elvis, the act of writing back wasn't about publicity, it was about reciprocity. He often said that the audience gave him energy, gave him purpose, and he felt it was only right to give something back, even if it was as simple as acknowledging their existence. In a world that too often made ordinary people feel overlooked, his letters were proof that they were seen by someone they admired. To Elvis, this was more than courtesy, it was dignity. These exchanges also shaped how he approached his own life. He became more reflective, aware that fame was fleeting, but kindness endured. Friends noted how Elvis would sometimes talk about the responsibility that came with influence. He believed that if God had given him a platform, then his job wasn't just to sing, but to comfort. The letters reminded him constantly that people weren't drawn only to his music, but to the humanity they sensed behind it. Even in his later concerts, when his health was faltering, Elvis's connection with fans remained evident. He would lean over the stage to hold a hand a moment longer, pause to listen when someone shouted a personal story, or make eye contact in a way that conveyed he was truly present. These gestures mirrored the spirit of his letters: recognition, acknowledgement, empathy. In the aftermath, the legacy of Elvis's correspondence grew. Fans who had written to him shared their stories publicly after his passing, and those small exchanges of ink and paper became part of the larger mosaic of his impact. Biographers often highlight his generosity in material terms: the cars, the houses, the donations, but the letters reveal something more intimate: a man who at his core understood the sacredness of human connection. The lesson endures long after his death. Elvis Presley proved that true greatness isn't measured by records sold or awards won, but by the lives touched along the way. Through his letters, he reminded the world that acknowledgement can heal, that a few sincere words can carry someone through their darkest nights. And in doing so, he left behind not just music, but a legacy of compassion woven quietly into the hearts of those who reached out and found him reaching back. When we look back on Elvis Presley's life, it's easy to focus on the headlines, the concerts, the records that broke barriers, but the quiet truth is that some of his most enduring impacts were written not in lights or music charts, but in ink on paper. His letters, humble, often brief, yet deeply sincere, revealed a man who understood that fame meant little if it wasn't rooted in humanity. For Elvis, responding to his fans wasn't about image or obligation, it was about empathy. He recognized that in a world full of noise and distraction, people longed for acknowledgement, for proof that their lives mattered. And through his simple replies, a few heartfelt lines, a signature, a word of encouragement, he offered something priceless, the reminder that no one is invisible. This was Elvis's deeper legacy. Beyond the king of rock and roll stood a man who saw himself as a bridge between hearts. His voice carried healing, but his letters proved that he cared enough to pause, listen, and respond. To the fans who held on to those notes for decades, they weren't tokens of celebrity worship, they were lifelines, moments of being truly seen. In many ways, Elvis's lesson is timeless. Each of us has the ability to reach across silence, to acknowledge someone else's existence with kindness and sincerity. It doesn't require fame, money, or a stage, only the willingness to care. As Elvis once said, the image is one thing, the human being is another. His letters remind us that behind every image, every story, every stranger, there is a human being longing to be recognized. So here's the question to reflect on. Who in your life might be waiting for acknowledgement? For a simple word that says, "I see you, you matter." Take a moment to think about it. Just as Elvis's letters carried comfort that outlived him, your words too can leave a lasting mark. If this story moved you, share it with someone who values Elvis's legacy, and let us know in the comments, how has empathy or music helped you through your own journey? Because in the end, Elvis showed us that the greatest gift we can give one another is not applause or admiration, but recognition. The quiet, powerful truth that every life tells a story worth hearing.